Taft, along with Wilson, whom we'll get to shortly, and Roosevelt, is considered to be one of the three progressive presidents. In this case, progressives of the early 1900s were likely to favor policies which shattered trust, protected the environment, and regulated big businesses to the use of a big government.
Taft was a Republican, but progressivism as an ideology itself was streaked throughout both main parties. As expected, Taft continued Roosevelt's legacy of trust-busting, breaking up 80 trusts, which is far more than Roosevelt's, and also of environmental conservation. Taft was far more moderate than most progressives, however. He didn't see big business as bad, for example, unless it stifled competition, and he pursued less societal reform than Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson. This wasn't at all bad at first for him. In fact, it's part of what landed him the presidency. Taft was more or less engineered for that. Roosevelt had handpicked him as his chosen successor, which pleased progressives, and conservatives were happy to be rid of Roosevelt, who they dubbed the Mad Messiah. Taft's Democratic opponent in the 1908 election, William Jennings Bryan, complained about having to run against two Tafts, the progressive William Howard Taft, who lobbied around the West in the same way Roosevelt had, and Taft's brother Charles, who floated around the eastern seaboard to reassure the Republican Party's conservative wing that everything would still stay somewhat moderate. But the problems began once Taft stepped into office. From day one, it was a balancing act between a radically progressive future and, like, a return to the actual Gilded Age. Roosevelt had commanded the Republican Party through sheer force, will, and charisma. He wielded the presidency in a far more powerful, though less constitutional way. Taft's attempt at wrangling his wasn't based on power-grabbing or a cult of personality, but rather upon a series of congressional compromises, which ultimately left everybody unhappy. Well, let's get into the policy. Other than busting up those monopolies, the last of which being the bathtub trust no less, Taft's political actions mostly served as a kind of curious warp to Roosevelt's. Taft pushed an agenda of conserving natural lands, for example, but he pushed this intense agenda softly. He wanted Congress to take the lead and pass such resolutions because he had a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. That being said, he oversaw the passage of the 16th Amendment, which allows the federal government to levy a progressive income tax, and the 17th Amendment, which enabled the direct election of senators. Taft's pet foreign policy project is called dollar diplomacy, and it's the expansion of American influence abroad by pumping as many dollars into a country as possible via American loans and American banks. Taft and his Secretary of State, Philander C. Knox, used this in Honduras, Nicaragua, China, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. At its ideal, dollar diplomacy is supposed to maximize the financial security in each country, thereby making safer playgrounds for American interests to frolic around in. In reality, the tide of revolution in nearly all of these countries made Taft's dollar diplomacy snuffed out before any real gain could be extracted.
The only thing it really served to do is prolong the Banana Wars, U.S. corporate imperialism in Latin America. These were a series of conflicts in which businesses like the United Fruit Company used mercenaries and superior technology to attempt to secure profit and control. McKinley sort of started them, but they didn't end until Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
It's time.
The election of 1912.
Taft's presidency, in which he, for example, fired Roosevelt's chief of the United States Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, took less modern, which is, to say bad stances on racial issues, and handled the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act notoriously poorly, worried Roosevelt enough to which he could be convinced by J.P. Morgan, who, totally had ulterior motives, to run as a third party, as a progressive, as a bull moose. And so the race has four candidates: Republican Taft, Progressive Roosevelt, Democrat Woodrow Wilson, and Socialist Eugene V. Debs.
It's worth noting that in contemporary American political discourse, all four of these people would have been seen as somewhere between crazy liberals and actual communists.
You should know by now what happens in terribly misrepresentative American elections. The Republican vote is split between Roosevelt and Taft, and Woodrow Wilson becomes the Democratic President of the United States.
Wilson, being the only Democratic president between Grover Cleveland and the Great Depression, realized that his party would need a ton of patronage in order to remain active within the federal government. This being said, he did so in perhaps the worst way that he possibly could have. Squatting on the banks of the Potomac River, Washington, D.C. was a horrifically segregated city during the turn of the century, excluding, of course, the federal government, which halted the practice during the Reconstruction era. Allying himself with the common people, however, Roosevelt began the slippery policy of undermining the integration of the federal government, a policy which Taft expanded upon and Northern progressives loathed, and a policy which Wilson takes the cake for doing the most damage with. Working closely with rich Southern Democrats in order to gain party capital, Wilson fully permitted the complete racial segregation of the United States federal government by the end of 1913. On March 21, 1915, Wilson saw the first movie screened in the White House. The name of said movie is as follows: The Birth of a Nation.
Well, putting inexcusable racism as far aside as we possibly can, let's try and analyze the rest of Wilson's presidency. Woodrow Wilson maneuvered the Underwood Tariff through Congress, which lowered tariffs on a national level, but at the same time made work of Taft's 16th Amendment by attaching an income tax to it. He created the Federal Reserve to pump more elastic currency into the United States, and the Federal Trade Commission to regulate trade on a federal level. In 1916, he and Congress passed a law which bans child labor, alright good, and another which gives railroad workers an 8-hour workday. Wilson narrowly won the 1916 election with his campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war."
It's time for World War I.
With the hypocrisy of his campaign slogan looming over his head, Wilson and the Democrat-controlled Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917, which gave postal officials the authority to ban newspapers and magazines from the mail and threatened anyone convicted of obstructing the draft with $10,000 fines and up to 20 years in prison. Then, 1 year later, they passed the Sedition Acts, which make it a federal offense to display any, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language, end quote, about the Constitution, the United States government, the American uniform, or the flag. Over 2,100 people were prosecuted under this. Anyway, you know what happens after that. The Allies win, and despite Wilson's calls for peace and reason, they paved the road for World War II. The only one of the 14 points which passes is the establishment of the League of Nations, which the US doesn't even join. Wilson has a stroke, racial riots break out all over the country, and Edith Wilson essentially becomes the first female president. I think what's most important to consider about Woodrow Wilson is that he talked so eloquently, sincerely, and absolutely passionately, and yet he failed so often to live up to his rhetoric. His 14 points are excellent. He did the legwork for creating the United Nations and won himself a Nobel Peace Prize. He fought for the rights of the Filipino and Puerto Rican and Samoan people who inhabit the islands the country sucked up after the Spanish-American War. He was an incredibly learned, freedom-loving, and masterful orator. He passed some of the most crucial progressive-era legislation the United States had, even if that legislation doesn't seem very radical today, and yet, he transforms himself into a Jefferson and then some. His disregard for the Constitution, for free speech, for the phrase all men were created equal, is absolutely astounding. There are a lot of lessons to be acquired from our only president who is also a professor. Maybe about half-assery, maybe about equality or freedom or integrity, but I think what's most important to consider about Woodrow Wilson is what he fought for. Wilson could have won big, could have settled so many domestic issues in so many easy areas that were well under his jurisdiction. And yet instead he opted for other shorelines. He stretched himself so thin in so many situations that were impossible for one person to succeed in. Maybe that's what it's all about. Regardless, wherever you are, and whatever you're doing, Mr. President, Professor, enemy and friend, I hope you figured it all out.